For the next 10, 15 minutes, I have been challenged. I have been challenged with giving a presentation about Creative Brain Week, about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the way that I'm going to start that is by talking about why music. Why did we start with music? Well, my normal answer would be because it works. Why start with music? Because it works. But in this environment, I would rarely get away with something so simplistic. I'd need to explain why it works. I'd need to, if I was talking to a neurologist, we might talk about whole brain systems being activated by listening and by moving. We might talk about a reduction in cortisol. We might talk about, if you're biology, the synchronicity of heartbeats. If you were in the Department of Divinity, you might talk about the spiritual aspect of community. If you were in the Department of Politics, you would probably talk about the power dynamics. And perhaps if you were in the Department of Anthropology, you would talk about why music evolved. And one reason music may have evolved is because it's about communication. It's a really efficient way of communication. Perhaps music evolved for communication, and language evolved to hide things so that we could keep stories to ourselves, to our own group of people, to the people that only speak the language that we speak. My background is as a cultural producer. I am fascinated by how do groups of people work together and how do you create the conditions in which that can happen. I make things with people. I try to figure out how rooms of people can connect together. One of those rooms that I create is the rooms for Creative Brain Week. And when we were thinking about this year, we were thinking about the unifying theme, what we think of as the coat hanger, the thing that people put all their ideas around. So whether you come from the Department of Anthropology or you come from the Department of Neuroscience, whether you come from having the lived experience of Alzheimer's and dementia or Parkinson's, whether you have none of those things but you come as an artist, what is the coat hanger around which we can connect our conversations? Because conversations are wild things. If it's not a wild thing, it's a lecture. Conversations are two ways. So what's the coat hanger? And we came up eventually, having thought about bridges and connections, with thinking better together. And then as the year has evolved, so we started this in October, that's become wildly more critical because it is evident that thinking better together, we're doing a fairly poor job of it as a species. And so these rooms become important. They gain in value by their rarity. But all is not unoptimistic. There is optimism. And some of the optimism we talked about yesterday. We talked about the Global Brain Health Institute, and we talked about this fellowship that's expanding around the world, the Atlantic Fellowship. So at this point, 1,097 people, I think, who are connected around a virtues-based system and process and explore the complexity of the world. And they arrive to that encounter with each other with very different expertise and experience. They might be neurologists, they might be activists, they might be artists. They have very different things that they're thinking about and considering. And so if you spend any time in their company, you realize very quickly that this is a very complicated community. That someone who is working for reparations, or someone who's working to end global conflict, or somebody who's working in a policy base for an equity-based rights of a river, it's an incredible position to be in. And each of those people have very different ways of articulating ambition or measuring success. Success might be a new paper, it might be a new policy, it might be a new piece of music, a new piece of theatre. It might be raising your kids, it might be having a stable home. And so those people are sufficiently motivated to cross continents and boundaries, to cross disciplines, to transgress the circumstances of their own birth and the limitations that may have imposed upon them. And it is a unique and extraordinary thing to sit across the table from someone whose entire body embodies the complexity of those different conditions, particularly when you have a room, when you have a group like the exhibition upstairs. But that group is no different than the rarity of this room. So this room is equally complex. Behind every face on every street, there beats a life of infinite complexity. And as Brendan so beautifully explained, part of the challenge is how do people listen and hear what is going on between that thinking. It's particularly interesting to do that, I think, within a university context, whether it's University of San Francisco, or whether it's Oxford, or whether it's Trinity College Dublin, or MTU, whatever the system of thinking is that you work with in the university institutions, because institutions are amazing. They continue an idea for a long time. You hear hundreds of years. My education, though, is a little different. I have a fine art degree, as I explained yesterday, that guarantees that you will be less well paid after qualification than if you never took it on. Statistically proven. I also have a forklift truck license because that helps. And I was particularly educated in these kind of people. So people who had used creative practice of one sort or another to raise conversations about complicated issues. But I was also educated by circus. Circus was a big part of my education. And circus is phenomenal. Firstly, it's about the management of risk. You go to watch the person walk across the tightrope wire. But the tightrope walker on their own isn't going to make an interesting evening's entertainment. They're not necessarily going to be the person who's expert at raising the tent. So actually what circus is also about is how different expertise collaborate to make an entertainment for you. And it has an economic function, and it has a community function, and it has joy. I also learned from building Carnival in the Caribbean. And Carnival in the Caribbean is a ritual event. It changes depending on the time of year and the culture it's in. And what it teaches is that people can change and evolve and develop the culture that they are born into. And in some ways, what Carnival enabled, particularly Caribbean Carnival, is for people that were disempowered, who were enslaved, could once a year dress up as somebody else and pretend. They could explore the power of transformation. If you could dress it, you could kind of feel it. And so that kind of work became part of what I did. In my 30s, I ran St. Patrick's Festival, the glorious Irish Christmas that will happen next week. And it's usually measured in terms of numbers of people and heads in beds and the amount of money it generates for the city. At the time I ran it, it was 80 million over 4 days for an investment of about 1 million. Now it's a lot more than that. But it's also about identity and well-being. The idea of processing down a street as an Irish tradition starts in New York. It starts with people that have migrated to New York, who walked down Fifth Avenue in the 1870s and say, I am loud and I am proud and I am here. And we took both of those ideas when I ran the event to invite young people particularly to dress as somebody else to see what it felt like. Or we worked with kids from difficult postcodes so they could walk down the street and be king and queen of the city for a day. And we played around with identity. What does Irishness look like? And that kind of idea I've continued for the last 20 odd years. I've used it to look at age. I've used it currently to look at death, dying, grief and loss. I use it through Creative Aging International. And the one thing that I want to bring from that to this is this idea that we make people curious. They get excited. What is that thing? Oh, it's amazing. They get engaged and they get skilled up, and then they go and do it themselves. And eventually that becomes a virtuous circle. It becomes a virtual circle of transformation. So, for the last couple of years, 5 years, we've taken that and applied it to neuroscience, equity, creativity, and we've tried to think about how they all fit together. We were particularly inspired by Chuck Feeney. Chuck Feeney was the founder of Global Brain Health Institute, of the Atlantic Institute. Chuck made his many millions, billions, by inventing duty-free, this gap between boundaries that created flow of cash, and that cash he then used to pay it forward with the Atlantic Institute, to invest in groups of people being able to have conversations across disciplines and boundaries. But obviously you have to be in the room for those conversations. So we are famous for quoting Chuck, who said, it's always just people in a room. Whatever the issue is, it's always just people in a room. And I was particularly animated and interested in what happens if you can't get into those rooms. So being me, I started rooms of my own, like this, and invited people in so that we can make connections between each other, between different disciplines and different lived experience. And gradually this has expanded, and we are learning from Singapore, which will happen in September, Mexico City, which is the new Creative Brain Week, which will happen in October, Cairo, Australia. What we are learning is about commonality and about difference, and the need to be able to listen to each other and hear what people are saying. And some of the things that we're learning is that transformation, amazing change is possible. 42% of dementias are avoidable with behavioural changes. We are learning, as Agustin was saying last night, about the impact of the environment upon the body, upon the brain, or the impact of the brain upon the body, upon the environment. And that is a complicated place to be. It's also complicated when you project forward, when you realise that 85% of the people over 65 in 2050 will be from low and medium income countries. So that complexity is in itself vital to be sat with. And that's what we're going to do over this week. We are going to think about thinking better together. We are going to think about ways that people think. We are going to think from sensation to systems. We are going to move between different modalities. So today is quite a lot of talk, but tomorrow will be a lot of music. Thursday will be a lot of body work and theatre. Friday will be looking at invisible impacts, like the development of stigma, by working with the Irish Museum of Modern Art, whose entire programme is based on this idea of radical hospitality. Well, what does that mean if you have an acquired brain injury? What does that mean if you find those places difficult to enter? How does the institution decide to change itself? And today, what we're going to do is lay the groundwork for that. So in a moment, Shane O'Mara, Louise Foote will talk about very different ways of thinking about the movement from an individual to a system. Pradeep Narayan will zoom in to talk about how research can be done with people who cannot stand in the same room. I missed the section. We'll introduce the idea of senses by thinking about smell. And then the afternoon we'll show you some fantastic case studies of extraordinary work that people are doing and developing as a way of inspiration. Then we'll end up the day with a reflection. And what I hope is, over the course of the week, that you are able to move from thinking better together to doing better together. Because the ambition of Creative Brain Week isn't about sitting and talking. It's about how do we get from here to somewhere better that we can already see. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. And we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to do the next session. Thank you.